Welcome, the anointed ones. The greatest threat to control is not rebellion, it is freedom that refuses to be owned. Think about that for a second. History has shown that revolutions never start with armies. They start with individuals who simply stop playing by the script. Did you know most power struggles in human history didn't collapse because the oppressed fought back violently, but because they stopped cooperating? That's the secret controllers never want you to know. Their power depends on your participation. The moment you withdraw it, their empire crumbles. And that's exactly why they painted you as the problem. Not because you were reckless, not because you were unstable, not because you were the villain, but because you slipped out of their grasp. They couldn't puppeteer your words, your decisions, your spirit. And in their frustration, they declared you the enemy. But here's the plot twist. They weren't really battling you. They were battling their own loss of control. It's almost funny when you think about it. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't start a war. You just stopped signing up for their circus. And suddenly the ringmasters started panicking, throwing accusations, juggling lies, and setting the lions loose like you were the entire show. But the truth is simple. Without your performance, their stage is empty. Without your compliance, their crown is paper. So today, we're going to pull the curtain back on this illusion and expose what really happened. They're finally seeing you were never the problem. They just couldn't control you. And once you see the difference, you'll never confuse their accusations for truth again. Number one, their hatred was never about you. It was about losing their grip. They didn't hate you because you were a bad person or because you were difficult to deal with. They hated you because they couldn't bend you into the shape they wanted. That's the truth nobody likes to admit. Control is the real reason behind most of the tension you faced. It was never about your character, your intentions, or your behavior. It was about their grip slipping. And once they realized you weren't built to be molded, their frustration turned into hostility. Think about how many times you were labeled stubborn, rebellious, or hard to love. Those words weren't accurate descriptions of you. They were emotional weapons meant to shame you into submission. You weren't being difficult. You were simply refusing to play the role they wrote for you. And the reason it bothered them so much is because deep down, they knew you weren't actually wrong. They just couldn't handle the reality that you had a backbone. Control only works when the person being controlled agrees to stay silent. You refused. You asked questions. You made decisions for yourself. And each time you did, it chipped away at the power they thought they had over you. That's why you became the target. They had to demonize your independence because it made their authority look weak. What they called arrogance was really your self-respect showing. What they called disrespect was simply you setting a boundary. The irony is, you weren't fighting them. You weren't plotting against them or even trying to prove a point. You were just being yourself, but that alone was enough to shake their foundation. They mistook your existence outside of their control as an attack, and in their panic, they tried to convince everyone around them that you were toxic, unstable, or the cause of the chaos. But the chaos wasn't in you. It was in their desperation to dominate what they could never truly own. Over time, the truth reveals itself. People begin to see the pattern. They notice that the problem only exists when someone refuses to bow down. And suddenly the narrative flips. You weren't the villain after all. You were the one strong enough to live free. And that strength, though it made you a target, is exactly what makes you unforgettable. Number two, you threatened the systems they benefited from. Control only works when the system is left unchallenged. The moment someone refuses to follow the script, the whole operation starts to shake. That's exactly why you became such a threat. You weren't just another voice blending into the crowd. You asked questions they didn't want asked. You noticed cracks they hoped no one would see, and you refused to pretend that their structure was flawless. That made you dangerous to the very systems they were benefiting from. The truth is, Many people don't actually want peace or fairness. They want comfort inside a system that favors them. As long as everyone follows the unspoken rules, don't question authority, don't step out of line, don't think differently, then everything looks fine on the surface. But you broke that rhythm. By being yourself, by thinking freely, by refusing to accept unfair rules, you disrupted their comfort. And when someone's comfort depends on control, disruption feels like an earthquake. That's why they treated you like a problem. You weren't causing chaos. You were exposing it. You weren't breaking anything. You were shining a light on what was already broken. But that light forced them to either fix what was wrong or admit they were invested in keeping it wrong. And because admitting that truth would strip them of power, they turned against you instead. What makes it even more revealing is that you never had to make loud declarations to shake them. Your independence was enough. Your unwillingness to fold under pressure was enough. That alone revealed how fragile their entire system was. Real authority doesn't panic when questioned. It answers. Real leadership doesn't crumble when challenged. It grows stronger. The fact that they reacted with rage, smear campaigns, and manipulation only proved that their power was built on shaky ground. So while they convinced others that you were the unstable one, the truth was the opposite. You didn't need control to stand. They did. You didn't need people to obey you to feel secure. They did. Your presence revealed what their authority really was, a performance, not power. And the day they realized you weren't going to play along anymore was the day their system lost its disguise. You weren't a threat to peace. You were a threat to control, and that was more than they could handle. Number 3. They didn't want peace. They wanted submission. They didn't want peace with you. They wanted control. That's the part people rarely admit out loud. They weren't looking for understanding. They weren't seeking balance. And they definitely weren't trying to build a healthy relationship. What they wanted was submission disguised as peace. They wanted you to smile, nod, and play along while they pulled the strings. And when you didn't, suddenly you became difficult, argumentative, or the problem. The truth is, peace has nothing to do with silence. Peace is built on respect, honesty, and fairness. But when someone has a controlling spirit, they swap peace for dominance. They believe things are only calm when everyone around them obeys without resistance. That's why every time you stood your ground, it wasn't received as a normal disagreement. It was treated like war. Your independence wasn't rebellion, but to them, it felt like it. Because the only version of peace they understood was one where you erased yourself to keep them comfortable. What frustrated them most was that you didn't need their approval to breathe. You weren't willing to shrink your opinions or dim your light just to avoid conflict, and that scared them, because it meant they couldn't dangle harmony over your head as a reward for compliance. The moment they realized you weren't chasing their version of peace, they lost the only weapon they had against you. This is why they twisted the narrative. They wanted people to believe you were the one stirring up chaos, when in reality, you were just refusing to bow to their control. They wanted the story to read that you couldn't get along, when the truth was, they couldn't function without dominance. And while they were busy painting you as the problem, what they were really revealing was how little they understood peace in the first place. Over time, that truth always comes out. People start to notice that the same person who accused you of being difficult always seems to have drama wherever they go. They start to see that you weren't the troublemaker. You were just unwilling to trade your soul for their comfort. That's when it becomes clear. You weren't fighting against peace. You were fighting for real peace. The kind that doesn't come from control, but from freedom. Number 4, you became a mirror that terrified them. They didn't despise you because of what you did to them. They despised you because of what you revealed about them. Every time you walked in your truth, they were confronted with their own lack of it. Your freedom showed them their captivity, your strength showed them their weakness, and your authenticity showed them how much of their life was a performance. And here's the uncomfortable reality. They couldn't separate their hatred of you from the hatred they carried for themselves. To look at you was to face the reflection they worked so hard to avoid. That's why their attacks always felt exaggerated. Their anger wasn't just about you. It was about what you represented. You became the evidence that it was possible to live without chains, that it was possible to choose integrity over control, that it was possible to live boldly without bowing to fear. And if you could do it, then what excuse did they have? That silent question haunted them because it exposed their smallness disguised as authority. The truth is, people who thrive on control can't stand mirrors. They don't want to see the cracks in their power or the emptiness in their confidence. They prefer shadows where their dominance looks convincing. But you stood there as light, and the reflection told a different story. Suddenly, their authority didn't look like strength. It looked like desperation. Their confidence didn't look like leadership. It looked like insecurity wearing a mask. This is why they fought so hard to distort your image. They needed to convince others that you were dangerous, unstable, or arrogant, because if the reflection was ever seen clearly, their entire facade would collapse. It wasn't you they were trying to destroy. It was the mirror you held up to them. And no matter how much they tried to break it, the reflection remained. Over time, what terrified them most became undeniable. You weren't the problem, you were the proof. Proof that authority without humility is weakness. Proof that control without respect is emptiness. Proof that freedom doesn't need permission to exist. And that's why they couldn't stand you. You didn't just walk freely, you reminded them that they could have too, if only they'd had the courage. Number 5. Their narrative collapsed when you stopped explaining yourself. For so long, they thrived on your explanations. Every time you tried to prove your innocence, defend your choices, or justify your boundaries, you unknowingly handed them material to twist. They didn't need the truth. They needed fragments of your words to manipulate into their own story. And the more you explained, the more they spun it, until it looked like you were guilty of things you never did. That was their game. Drag you into endless explanations so they could keep control of the narrative. But then something shifted. You stopped defending yourself. You stopped arguing your value. You stopped performing the exhausting task of proving to people who had already decided not to see you. And in that moment, everything they built began to collapse. Because without your words to twist, they had nothing left but their lies. And lies sound a lot less convincing when they stand alone without your energy holding them up. That's the part that made them panic. They expected your silence to make you look weak. They thought your refusal to respond would prove them right. But instead, it backfired. The absence of your defense forced people to question why you weren't scrambling anymore. It made others notice that the only voices screaming were the ones accusing you. And suddenly, the weight of suspicion shifted, not toward you, but toward them. What's powerful about this is that your refusal to explain wasn't just silence, it was strength. It was the quiet statement that your worth was not up for debate, your truth was not up for trial, and your soul was not a courtroom for their insecurities. You didn't need to fight for your place anymore because your existence itself was the proof. And in the end, that's what broke their narrative. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a long speech, not even revenge. Just the calm, steady refusal to keep feeding their lies with your energy. You showed them the truth doesn't need constant defending, but lies do. And once you stepped out of the game, they were left alone with their own false story, crumbling under the weight of its emptiness. Number 6, they mistook your boundaries for rebellion. When someone thrives on control, the word no feels like a personal attack. To them, it isn't just a simple refusal. It's a threat to their authority, a crack in the illusion of dominance they've worked so hard to maintain. That's why your boundaries were never received as healthy or necessary. They twisted them into rebellion, as though you were staging a revolt, when in reality you were simply protecting your humanity. You weren't trying to overthrow them, you weren't seeking chaos, and you weren't even being disrespectful. You were doing what every healthy person has the right to do, deciding what you will and will not tolerate. But in their world, respect only had one definition: compliance. If you obeyed, you were good. If you questioned, resisted, or set limits, you were disrespectful. It had nothing to do with morality, and everything to do with their need to feel superior. What they failed to see is that boundaries are not weapons. They are shields. A shield doesn't hurt anyone. It just protects the person holding it. But to someone who's addicted to control, even your shield feels like a sword. Your refusal to be drained, manipulated, or disrespected was never an act of war, but they treated it as one because it meant they no longer had unlimited access to you. The irony is that the very boundaries they mocked or resented were the same ones that exposed their true intentions. A person who genuinely cares about you will respect your limits, even if they don't fully understand them. A person who only wants power over you will fight your boundaries like their life depends on it. And every time they reacted to your no with anger, they revealed that they weren't seeking love, partnership, or mutual respect. They were seeking control. Over time, this is what makes the truth undeniable. You weren't rebellious. You were reasonable. You weren't destructive. You were discerning. You weren't tearing things down. You were preserving your dignity. They called it rebellion because that was the only language they understood. But in reality, your boundaries were the most honest form of self-respect you could have shown. And that respect, even when misunderstood, is the very thing that keeps you free. Number 7. They had to demonize you to justify their control. They couldn't control you outright, so they had to create a story that made it look like control was necessary. That's why they painted you as the villain. It was never about truth. It was always about strategy. If they could convince others that you were unstable, selfish, or dangerous, then suddenly their controlling behavior wouldn't look like oppression. It would look like protection or leadership. The smear campaign wasn't a reaction, it was a weapon. Notice how carefully it was crafted. They exaggerated your flaws, twisted your words, and highlighted your mistakes while conveniently hiding their own. They turned ordinary disagreements into tales of rebellion, and they reframed your independence as arrogance. The goal wasn't to describe you accurately. The goal was to distort you so much that others wouldn't question their authority. If you looked guilty enough, then their control could pass as wisdom. This tactic works because people are quicker to believe a loud lie than a quiet truth, and they knew that. They knew if they shouted their version of events long enough, people would stop asking questions. So they made you the scapegoat. Every problem in the environment, every conflict, every tension, they pinned it on you. That way, nobody had time to ask why the person pointing fingers always seemed to be at the center of the storm. But here's what they underestimated: lies may run fast, but they can't outrun time. Eventually, people start noticing patterns. They see that your so-called chaos disappears when you're absent, while the one who labeled you as a villain keeps stirring trouble wherever they go. They realized the demonization was never about you. It was a disguise for their own dysfunction. The most powerful part of this exposure is that you didn't need to fight for it. You didn't have to defend yourself endlessly or chase after their accusations. The truth simply began to reveal itself because reality has a way of cutting through performance. And in the end, their attempt to demonize you didn't strip away your value. It stripped away their credibility. They wanted to make you look like the villain so no one would see their oppression. But now, everyone sees the truth. The villain was the one holding the chains. Number 8, your independence made their influence irrelevant. What shook them the most wasn't your defiance. It was your independence. You weren't waiting on their approval. You weren't desperate for their resources, and you weren't clinging to their validation. That made you untouchable in ways they couldn't tolerate. Because control thrives on dependency. When someone needs you for money, status, connections, or acceptance, you can dictate their choices. But when that dependency is gone, control dies on the spot. And that's exactly what your life revealed to them. They couldn't buy your loyalty with small favors because you weren't starving for crumbs. They couldn't threaten you with rejection because you were already at peace with standing alone. They couldn't lure you back with guilt because you knew the difference between genuine care and emotional blackmail. Every tactic that worked on others slid off of you. And that's when they realized you were the one person they couldn't own. Independence doesn't just frustrate controllers, it exposes them. Because when their influence stops working on you, it becomes clear that the power they claimed to have was never real authority. It was manipulation dressed up as leadership. They weren't guiding anyone, they were baiting, bribing, and intimidating. And you blew that cover simply by being whole without them. This is why your freedom felt like betrayal to them. In their mind, loyalty meant dependence. If you weren't leaning on them, you must have been turning against them. But that was never the case. You simply chose to live grounded in your own strength. You weren't rejecting connection, you were rejecting control. And they didn't know how to function in a relationship that wasn't built on leverage. The irony is, what they feared most is what made you unshakable. Your independence freed you from their manipulation, but it also freed you from constant fear. You didn't have to wonder if they'd pull the rug from under you because your stability wasn't tied to their hands. And that's what makes independence so powerful. It doesn't just weaken their control, it strengthens your peace. In the end, your self-sustaining spirit revealed the truth they tried to hide. Their influence only mattered when someone needed it. You didn't. And in that moment, all their strategies, threats, and bribes became useless. Your independence wasn't rebellion, it was liberation. And liberation is something they could never contain. Number 9. They realized power over you was borrowed, not earned. The control they once held over you was never real. It was borrowed. It only existed because you hadn't yet discovered how much strength you carried. Maybe you were conditioned to believe you needed their approval, or you hadn't realized how much freedom you truly had. For a while, that gave them leverage. They mistook your silence for weakness, your patience for permission, and your loyalty for submission. But none of it was earned. It was only possible because you hadn't fully stepped into yourself. That's the thing about borrowed power. It has an expiration date, and the moment you woke up to who you were, the clock ran out. They couldn't intimidate you with the same tactics anymore. They couldn't guilt-trip you into compliance. They couldn't use fear, shame, or rejection as weapons because you had stopped seeing them as authorities and started seeing them as manipulators. What they once framed as dominance was suddenly exposed for what it really was: desperation dressed as control. When power isn't earned, it can't last. Earned power comes with respect. It's rooted in wisdom, trust, and real influence. Borrowed power, on the other hand, depends on illusions and blind spots. It requires the other person to stay unaware of their own worth. That's why your awakening was such a threat. By reclaiming your strength, you cut off the very supply that gave them influence. And when the source dries up, the system collapses. The irony is, they never actually had the kind of power they thought they did. They weren't strong leaders. They were opportunists taking advantage of your unawareness. The day you stopped handing them access to your emotions, your choices, and your energy was the day their throne turned into an empty chair. That's why they fought so hard to pull you back under. It wasn't love they were losing, it was leverage. In the end, the truth became undeniable. Their control was never real authority, only borrowed access. And once you reclaimed what was always yours, they were left exposed. No strategies left, no cards to play, no grip to hold. Just the hollow sound of desperation trying to imitate power. And from that point on, the only person with real authority over your life was you. Number 10. Their control collapsed when you refused to perform. For as long as you stayed in the role they assigned you, their script worked perfectly. You were the scapegoat when they needed blame, the pleaser when they needed comfort, the silent one when they needed control, and the sacrifice when they needed someone to carry the weight of their dysfunction. It wasn't because you were weak. It was because you were conditioned to believe that playing those roles kept the peace. But eventually, you realized peace built on performance isn't peace at all. And the moment you refused to perform, their whole system began to unravel. Controllers rely on an audience to believe their act. They need you to play along so their narrative looks convincing. Without your participation, their story starts to look strange. Who do they scapegoat when you refuse to carry false blame? Who do they silence when you find your voice? Who do they exploit when you no longer volunteer yourself as a sacrifice? The answer is no one. And suddenly, the play they've been directing turns into an empty stage with no actors left to prop it up. That's why they fought so hard to drag you back into character. Your absence didn't just expose the truth to others, it exposed the truth to themselves. They weren't leaders, they were manipulators. They weren't protectors, they were exploiters. They weren't victims of your so-called rebellion. They were dependent on your compliance to keep their facade alive. The second you stopped playing your part, their entire production looked cheap and transparent. And here's the most powerful part. You didn't have to destroy them. You didn't need revenge, schemes, or retaliation. All it took was walking off their stage and reclaiming your own script. By stepping away, you forced them to face a reality they could no longer dress up with lies. That without someone to control, they had nothing. Their power didn't collapse because you fought harder. It collapsed because you stopped performing altogether. In the end, your refusal became the loudest truth. You showed that their influence wasn't real power. It was theater. And when you chose authenticity over acting, the curtain fell, the lights dimmed, and their performance was revealed for what it always was, a fraud built on borrowed roles you no longer agreed to play. Number 11. They hated you for choosing truth over belonging. Most people are willing to trade a little bit of themselves to belong. They'll stay quiet when something feels wrong, they'll bend their values to avoid conflict, and they'll go along with lies just to keep a seat at the table. But you refused. You chose truth over belonging, and that's why they hated you. You wouldn't shrink yourself to make others comfortable, and you wouldn't pretend to be someone you weren't just to fit into their mold. That integrity made you untouchable, but it also made you a threat to anyone who built their comfort on conformity. They couldn't understand why you wouldn't play along. To them, belonging was the highest prize, even if it meant living a lie. But to you, belonging without truth wasn't belonging at all. It was imprisonment dressed up as acceptance. That's what made you different. You weren't afraid to lose a crowd if it meant keeping your soul intact. And when they realized they couldn't twist you into their version of acceptable, they labeled you as the outcast. Not because you were broken, but because you refused to break. The irony is, they were never rejecting you for who you truly were. They were rejecting the mirror you held up. Your choice exposed their compromise. Your honesty reminded them of the lies they told themselves to survive. And instead of rising to that same level of truth, they tried to push you out so they wouldn't have to face what they lacked. They mistook your courage as arrogance, when in reality it was the very thing they wished they had but didn't dare to embrace. In time, the label of outcast becomes the proof of freedom. You didn't belong to their crowd because you weren't meant to be caged by their conditions. They wanted you smaller, quieter, more agreeable, but you chose to stand whole, even if it cost you approval. And that choice made you free in a way they could never be, while chained to acceptance. That's why their hatred ran so deep. You didn't just reject their mold, you exposed the emptiness of it. You showed that truth is worth more than belonging, that integrity is worth more than approval, and that freedom is worth more than their acceptance. They lost nothing by rejecting you, but you lost nothing by refusing to betray yourself. In fact, You gained the one thing they'll never have, the ability to live fully free without permission. Number 12. They didn't lose control of you. They lost control of the story. From the beginning, their greatest weapon wasn't power over you. It was power over the story. They knew if they could control how others saw you, they wouldn't need to control you directly. That's why they twisted your image, exaggerated your flaws, and spun lies that painted you as unstable, ungrateful, or impossible to deal with. As long as people believed their version, they could keep their reputation intact and their grip unchallenged. But the truth has a way of outliving lies, and that's where their downfall began. At first, it seemed like their smear campaigns were working. They shouted their narrative loud enough that some people believed it. But the longer the story went on, the less it added up. People started noticing that the problem wasn't behaving like a problem. You weren't out there causing chaos. You were living your life, standing strong, minding your business. Meanwhile, the very ones who called you unstable couldn't keep their own stories straight. The cracks in their lies grew too obvious to ignore. That's when fear set in. Not fear of you as a person, but fear of what would happen if people started asking the right questions. Because if the spotlight ever shifted, it would reveal that the problem was never you. It was the manipulations, the fabrications, and the desperate attempts to keep control through deceit. Their entire power relied on keeping the illusion alive. Once the illusion started to fade, their authority started to crumble. And here's the part that stung them the most. You didn't have to fight to expose them. You didn't need to campaign for your innocence or wage war to clear your name. All you had to do was live in truth, long enough for the lies to collapse under their own weight. Reality always outlasts fabrication. Eventually, people saw the difference between your steady consistency and their constant drama. They thought they had you cornered by controlling the story. But in the end, they only revealed how terrified they were of being exposed. You weren't the danger to their world, the truth was. And once the truth grew louder than their noise, their control was gone. Not because you lost the battle, but because the story they built couldn't survive reality. Number 13, you proved that love without freedom isn't love. What they offered you was never love. It was possession disguised as care. They wanted the benefits of your loyalty without giving you the respect that loyalty requires. They wanted closeness, but only on their terms, where your needs didn't matter and your voice didn't count. They wanted obedience, but stripped of choice, as though your individuality was something to be erased for the sake of their comfort. That wasn't love. It was captivity dressed up as connection. And the moment you realized it, the illusion shattered. Love without freedom is nothing more than a contract of control. If you can't say no without punishment, then your yes doesn't mean anything. If you can't express your truth without fear of backlash, then your silence isn't peace, it's suffocation. What they wanted wasn't partnership, it was ownership. They wanted you close enough to feed their ego, but not free enough to challenge their authority. That arrangement might look like love from the outside, but inside it feels like a cage. The power of your decision was in recognizing that captivity and refusing to call it love anymore. Walking away wasn't just leaving them, it was reclaiming your definition of love. You proved that real love cannot exist where freedom is denied. Because love that demands silence isn't love. Love that demands obedience without respect isn't love. Love that punishes independence isn't love. Real love celebrates freedom, it doesn't fear it. That's why your choice hit them so hard. As long as you stayed, they could keep pretending their control was affection. They could convince themselves and others that you were loved because you were near. But when you left, the mask fell. Suddenly the truth was undeniable. If what they offered had been real love, it would have made you freer, not smaller. Instead, it was dependency, manipulation, and fear, all wrapped up in the word love. In the end, your strength proved what they tried to hide, that their version of love wasn't love at all. You exposed the counterfeit by choosing truth over captivity. And though it broke their illusion, it built your freedom. Because you refused to confuse chains for commitment, and you refused to trade your humanity for their control. And that refusal is what makes your love, the love you give and the love you now accept, something they could never replicate. Number 14. In the end, they saw you were the constant and they were the chaos. In the end, the truth cut through all the noise. They weren't battling your flaws, they were battling their own chaos. You were steady, even when storms surrounded you. You were consistent, even when they tried to provoke you into reactions that weren't in your nature. They wanted you to crack, to explode, to fall apart so they could point and say, "See, you're the problem." But no matter how much pressure they applied, you didn't fold into their script. You stayed rooted, and that's what exposed them. Control thrives when the target is unstable. If you had been impulsive, reckless, or constantly shifting, they would have used that as proof to tighten their grip. But your clarity made their schemes look messy. Your strength made their games look weak. Your stability left no place for their lies to land, and that's when the cracks in their performance started to show. They weren't managing you. They were struggling to keep their own dysfunction hidden. This is why they had to flip the narrative. They called you dramatic because you wouldn't be silent. They called you unstable because you refused to be manipulated. They called you cold because you wouldn't bow down to emotional blackmail. But over time, the pattern became too obvious. The so-called chaos was always coming from them. The lies, the outbursts, the control tactics, the endless shifting of rules, it all came from their desperation to rule over something they could never truly create, your peace. And here's the irony. They thought your steadiness was weakness. They thought your calm meant they had power over you. But that calm was the very thing that dismantled them. They realized that you weren't the one spiraling. You were the one observing. You weren't the one flailing. You were the one enduring. They were chaos wearing the mask of authority, and you were the constant that stripped the mask off. By the time the truth was undeniable, their accusations couldn't hold up anymore. Everyone could see the contrast. You weren't the storm, they were. You weren't the confusion, they were. Your presence became proof of their instability, and that's the part they'll never forgive. That without lifting a hand, without matching their chaos, you revealed who was truly out of control. Control was never the real issue. You were never hard to love, never impossible to understand, never the villain in their story. The problem was that you couldn't be contained, and that truth unraveled every lie they built around you. They mistook your boundaries for rebellion, your independence for arrogance, your steadiness for coldness. But time has proven otherwise. You weren't unstable, you were the constant. You weren't disloyal, you were simply unwilling to call captivity love. You weren't the problem. You were the proof that their control was always borrowed, never earned. And now their narrative lies in ruins. What they demonized in you was what they secretly lacked: courage, integrity, and freedom. What they painted as rebellion was simply your refusal to abandon yourself. What they called chaos was their own dysfunction mirrored back at them. In the end, it wasn't your voice that exposed them, but your refusal to perform in their play any longer. So let this be clear. You don't need to apologize for being uncontrollable. You don't need to shrink yourself to make others feel powerful. You don't need to trade your freedom for acceptance. The very fact that they had to twist, accuse, and manipulate proves that your strength shook them more than compliance ever could. The truth is undeniable now. They finally see you weren't the problem. You were the one who stood tall while everything around you shook. You were the mirror, the constant, the force they couldn't tame. And that, more than anything, is your victory. Family, if this message hit you deep, don't just keep it to yourself. Spread it. Someone out there is wrestling with the same battles and needs to hear this truth right now. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button, tap the like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and share this with someone who needs the reminder that they are not the problem. They are the proof. Your support helps this message reach further, touch more lives, and continue to expose the lies that try to keep people bound. Stay connected, stay growing, and let's keep shining light where others try to cast shadows. God bless you.